When Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, "Pray without ceasing," most people I've talked to have one of two reactions. Either they nod along and quietly file it under things saints do, or they genuinely try to figure out what that could possibly mean for someone with a job, a commute, and a phone full of notifications. I always assumed constant prayer was essentially monk language, beautiful in theory, functional only in a monastery where the entire day is built around liturgical hours and there's nobody asking you to join a meeting at 9 a.m. And for a long time I treated it as aspirational at best, the kind of verse you admire without expecting to actually live. Then I started looking more carefully at how Padre Pio actually operated, and the picture that emerges is not what I expected. Because Padre Pio was not, by any reasonable measure, a man with a quiet life. He heard confessions for up to 16 hours a day. He corresponded with thousands of spiritual children across Europe. He celebrated Mass, which by multiple accounts lasted between 1.5 to 2 hours due to the intensity of his prayer. He was constantly surrounded by people, constantly interrupted, constantly in demand. And yet the consistent testimony from those who knew him, documented in the accounts gathered by Alessio Parente and in Ruffin's biography, is that he never seemed to leave prayer, even in the middle of conversation, even in the middle of a crowded corridor. So the question isn't whether constant prayer is possible. Padre Pio apparently did it. The question is how, and the answer, once you find it, is more practical than mystical. Let's actually take the problem seriously for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a dismissal. The standard objection to pray without ceasing is a practical one. Attention is finite. You cannot hold two things in conscious focus simultaneously. If you are doing mental arithmetic, you are not also composing a prayer. If you are listening to someone speak, you are not simultaneously engaged in interior dialogue with God. Neuroscience and common experience both confirm this. Divided attention means reduced attention on both fronts. So the literalist reading, that every waking second should be occupied with the same quality of conscious, articulated prayer you bring to Sunday Mass, runs directly into the hard wall of how human cognition actually works. And I think most people intuitively sense this, which is why the verse tends to get quietly shelved rather than wrestled with. There's also a subtler problem. Even people who try to maintain constant prayer often describe it collapsing into a kind of anxious monitoring of their own spiritual state. Am I praying enough right now? Is this prayer? Does this count? Which is almost the opposite of what Paul seems to be describing, something that is effortless and continuous, not a performance being maintained through willpower. So if the literalist reading doesn't work and the anxious monitoring version doesn't work, what's left? That's where Padre Pio's actual practice becomes genuinely interesting, because he wasn't teaching people to do something neurologically impossible. He was describing a different architecture of attention entirely. Here's the reframe. Padre Pio distinguished, clearly and consistently, across his letters and his direction of souls, between what you might call the foreground and the background of the interior life. The foreground is where formal prayer lives, the Mass, the Rosary, the liturgy of the hours, the deliberate act of sitting down and directing your attention toward God. This is important. He never minimized it. But the background is something different. It's an orientation of the will that doesn't require the foreground to be running at full volume. It's closer to what the Desert Fathers, particularly John Cassian, writing in the early 5th century in his conferences, called purity of heart, a state in which the fundamental direction of the person is toward God, even when the conscious mind is occupied with other things. Cassian's conferences were, incidentally, foundational texts for Western monasticism. Benedict of Nursia drew heavily on them when writing his rule. And the tradition they describe, of prayer as an underlying orientation rather than an unbroken stream of conscious attention, runs directly through the medieval mystics, through the Cloud of Unknowing, and into the practice Padre Pio was directing his spiritual children toward. The specific tool he recommended most consistently was short, repeated prayers, what the Eastern Church calls arrow prayers, brief, sharp, directed. The most famous of these in the Eastern tradition is the Jesus Prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. 12 words, repeatable in any circumstance. capable of being said internally while doing almost anything else. Padre Pio wasn't teaching the Jesus prayer by name. That's primarily an Eastern Orthodox practice, but the structure he recommended was functionally identical. Short invocations, repeated throughout the day, across any activity. My God, I love you. Jesus, mercy. Lord, let me see you in this. Phrases short enough to slip between the demands of the day without interrupting them. The idea is not that these phrases replace the foreground of formal prayer. It's that they keep the background orientation alive. They're like a thread you return to, briefly, dozens of times a day. Not because you've been consciously holding it the whole time, but because you've trained the habit of reaching for it. What I find most useful about Padre Pio's approach is how concrete it was. He didn't tell people to feel more spiritual. He gave them structures, specific ones. The first was what he called spiritual reading. And by this he didn't mean long theological study sessions. He meant short, daily contact with a text that fed the background orientation. A few paragraphs of the Gospels in the morning, enough to give the day a point of reference. Something the mind could return to without effort, the way a phrase of music stays with you after you've heard it. The second was what he consistently described as offering up ordinary actions. Before eating, before starting work, before a difficult conversation, a brief, silent handing over of the moment to God. Not a long prayer, not even a full sentence necessarily. Just the interior gesture of acknowledging that the next thing is not happening outside of God's presence. He wrote to one of his spiritual daughters, this is in the Epistolario, his collected letters, that she should sanctify every action, even the smallest, by performing it with purity of intention. That phrase, purity of intention, is doing a lot of work. It means that the action itself becomes a form of prayer, not because you are saying words while doing it, but because the will behind it is oriented correctly. This is where the pray without ceasing of Paul and the practice of Padre Pio converge. Paul wasn't describing a neurological feat. He was describing a life in which the will is so consistently oriented toward God that even ordinary actions carry the weight of prayer, not because of what is being said, but because of who is doing them and in what direction their life is pointed. The difference between a person who prays and a person who is praying constantly in Padre Pio's framework is not the number of hours spent in formal prayer, it's whether the background is running. Here's the thing I didn't expect when I started looking into this. The obstacle to constant prayer, according to Padre Pio's letters, and honestly according to most of the tradition on this, isn't time. It's not even attention span. It's what he called dissipation. The scattering of the interior life across too many things that don't point anywhere in particular. He was writing in the early 20th century, well before smartphones, but the diagnosis is almost uncomfortably current. He described souls who were genuinely devout, who went to Mass, who said their prayers, who wanted to live well, but who, in the gaps between formal prayer, filled their attention so completely with noise and distraction that the background orientation had no room to develop. The foreground was functioning, the background was empty, and his prescription wasn't more formal prayer time, it was less noise. Not as a punishment or an ascetic discipline for its own sake, but because the background can only run if there's enough quiet for it to establish itself. You can't maintain an orientation you never feel. I think this is the part that gets lost in most modern conversations about prayer habits. We talk about adding a morning routine, adding a gratitude journal, adding 5 minutes of silence. Padre Pio was talking about subtracting, creating the conditions in which something that is already trying to exist can actually find its footing. That's a harder ask. It requires looking at what fills the in-between moments of your day and being honest about what it's doing to the interior life. Not every answer will be comfortable. So if you want to actually try what Padre Pio was describing, not as a spiritual project, just as an experiment, here's the most concrete version of it I can offer. Pick one short phrase. It can be, Lord, have mercy. It can be, Jesus, I trust in you. It can be as simple as thank you. And for 1 week, use it as a returning point. Not constantly. That's the wrong frame. Just repeatedly. Every time you notice the background is empty, reach for it. Let it do less than you expect at first. The goal isn't to feel spiritual. The goal, in Padre Pio's framework, is to train a direction. And direction, practiced long enough, becomes orientation. Orientation, over time, starts to look like what Paul was describing. If you try it, or if you've already been doing something like this and have a phrase that works for you, drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what people actually use day to day, because I think the variety of those answers would be worth more than anything I could add here.